So through the work of feminist criminology, we've come up with a profile of a typical female delinquent. For those of you who recognize the young lady being brought away in handcuffs on the right-hand side of the slide, that is Felicia Snoop Pearson, who portrayed the character Snoop on The Wire and unfortunately was herself arrested in Baltimore a few years ago, suspected to be participating in a large drug ring in the Baltimore area. But anyway, the research that's been done in feminist criminology over the past 10 to 15 years has come up with what we would call a profile of a typical female delinquent and really her pathway into delinquent behavior. And what I want you to see is the fact that this path is a little bit different, maybe, from what we know about a typical male's pathway into delinquency and crime. One thing that we know is a common marker early in life for women who are going to end up becoming delinquents and criminals is the fact that a lot of them report a history of sexual and physical abuse in their life, usually from someone either in their family or close to their family as they're growing up. Now, because of this, a lot of these women report that some of the earliest technically illegal behavior they engaged in was frequently running away to escape this behavior, this experience of abuse. Now, you all know at this point that when you're under 16, you can technically get arrested for being a runaway, for running away from home. So one of the problems that researchers have noticed with females who get into a life of crime is, they kind of get into the system early because they're running away from abusive relationships and can't necessarily do that much about the fact that they're technically becoming delinquents as a result of it. Another thing that we notice is typical of females in terms of their pathway into delinquency and crime is a lot of them report using crime as a survival technique, a lot more than men necessarily do. A lot of times in the theory that we've learned about so far, you hear about crime as kind of something that men do for fun, to get excitement, to get thrills, to support some kind of an illegal lifestyle. A lot more women report needing to commit crime to get necessities, to get money, to pay for things like rent, pay for things for their children. It tends to be a more prominent theme in females who are criminals and delinquents than it is with men. We also know that a typical feature of women who are engaged in criminal activity is the fact that they tend to be in relationships and have contact and involvement with men who actually demand further involvement in criminal activity. So a lot of women who are chronic, serious, maybe offenders describe the fact that one of the reasons why they're engaged in this criminal activity is at the behest or the order of a man, whether it's having some minor role in the drug trade or engaging in prostitution, any number of crimes. The point here is that a lot of women describe one of the big motivations and reasons behind them staying in criminal activity is they have to do that to maintain the relationship with a man in their life. And another typical feature of a female delinquency is the fact that many females describe their initial entrance into drug and alcohol addiction and abuse as a means to cope with their prior sexual abuse history, as a means to cope with their, kind of their sense of alienation and lack of ability to rise out of the situations that they're in. A lot more women describe that as being the reason that they get into drugs and alcohol. One thing we know about females who are in correctional facilities and in juvenile detention facilities is there is a high rate of drug and alcohol addiction amongst these women. And one of the reasons that we think that happens is they have reported that they do that to kind of shut out some of the bad things that are happening to them in their lives. Another area of research in feminist criminology has to do with understanding the role of victimization in leading women into crime and delinquency. So females who get frequently seriously victimized throughout their lives are at a much higher risk than other people for for crime and delinquency. Research that was done a few years ago by a University of Maryland professor, Laura Dugan, and one of her colleagues, so Dugan and Castro, basically did research in the state of Maryland in women's facilities, looking at women who were in jail and comparing them to women out in society. So hypothetically looking at kind of criminal delinquent women and comparing them to non-criminal women, and examining, what are some of the predictors of violence against women, of female victimization, and are the women who are in jail at higher risk? Are they going to report more of those predictors? So let's take a look at a couple of the results from this study. For one of the predictors that Dugan and Castro noted is all females, jailed and non-jailed women, reported that those who had ever been victimized violently in the past reported, for the most part, that this was done from people that they knew, from non-strangers. So whether it's a husband, a significant other, a father, some other family member, someone close to them, that tends to be much more common for women in terms of who their attackers are. And that's a little bit different from men. Men are a little bit more likely, when they report being victimized, to report that it's not necessarily always someone that they're close to. So that's kind of one way that women's offending and women's victimization seems to be a little bit unique. We also know that the groups that are the most likely to become victims of violent crime in terms of women are women that we would call marginalized populations. So in terms of who would fit into a marginalized population for women, these are women who are very low income, who are poor, women who are probably of a racial or ethnic minority, who have extremely low levels of education, and who have very little chance at getting a legitimate job and making a living wage on their own. So we would call women that fit into that kind of characterization women who are marginalized. And they're at a much higher risk for violent victimization, partly because we believe that these are women who have to attach themselves to men in order to survive, in order to live comfortably. And often because that relationship is set up so that they are dependent on someone who is able to kind of be a domineering force, we believe that that has a lot to do with why these women are so much more likely to be victimized. Another interesting thing that the Dugan and Castro study did is it looked at jailed women in detention or prison, and it compared them to non-jailed women, kind of non-criminal others, on a couple different kind of factors, predictors. And they found some interesting differences. For one, for jailed women, it really made no difference whether or not they were married in terms of how likely they were to be violently victimized. Marriage for jailed women doesn't seem to have the same protective factor that it does for non-jailed women. For women out in normal society being married, the women who were married were much less likely to have reported victimization than the single women. They also noticed in the study that jailed women were much more likely to report that they owned weapons prior to being imprisoned or incarcerated. They were much more likely to report either owning or carrying a gun, and the jailed women were much more likely to report that if they were faced with a violent situation, they'd be much more likely to retaliate and attack their attackers, as opposed to just kind of minimizing the chances for violence. Okay, so we're going to take a step away from feminist criminology and talk about the final category of theories that you'll need to know for your exam. And those theories fall into what we would call integrated theories. So all the theories that we've learned about in this class so far, if you think back to things like social control theory, social learning theory, general strain theory, they all tend to focus on kind of a single cause that, however it develops, ends up being the main reason why somebody commits crime. Think back to all the models that we've made of theories. That'll kind of make sense to you, that there are background factors that lead to one single issue, and that issue then leads to criminal behavior. Well, there are a lot of people who don't like how these traditional theories are built, and some critics of those traditional theories say that we need to incorporate a lot more into our explanations of criminal behavior, coming up with things that look much more like a multi-factor approach would be a good idea, according to these critics. So essentially, instead of saying that something like the learning process causes people to commit crime, critics say that's probably part of the reason, but there are probably other things that matter. And if you build a theory that's only acknowledging one issue, it's incomplete. So integrated theorists respond to the criticisms of traditional theories by integrating essentially some of those traditional theories into only a few theories. So instead of having 20 different theories of crime, integrated theorists say, let's combine the theories that are similar enough that they could be combined, and instead of having, so many different theories of crime, let's just combine into one or two or three. And let's identify the factors that are involved in criminal behavior that are the most important. So essentially how the critics approached criminology, and this happened really at the end of the 20th century, in the late 80s, early 90s, is critics basically looked at the history of criminological theory, all of these theories that you've been learning about for the past month or so, and became very overwhelmed by the sheer number of theories that are out there. Some of you might feel the same way right now. We just have a ton of theories in this field, different explanations for why people commit crime, and they can't all be right. These ideas that in some ways are kind of similar to each other, in some ways not, they can't all be the most important, the be-all end-all explanation. There has to be some way, according to somebody who believes in integrated theories, there has to be some way to combine those ideas and really kind of condense what we know into a few theories. So their solution is to integrate. That's why these are called integrated theories. And the solution is to take parts of those theories that you guys already know and combine them. Get rid of the things that we don't think actually matter, take the parts that do, and combine them into one integrated theory. And if there is a more general explanation of crime that is somehow related to another theory of crime that maybe only explains particular behaviors or a particular group, have that general theory of crime kind of subsume the smaller theories. So the justification behind doing this is that if you integrate theories, you're going to explain more of the variation in behavior. So think about, for example, Hershey's social bonds theory. One of the criticisms of that theory is that it does make sense. It was able to be proven that some part of it seems to make sense, but we know that it only explains about 2 to 4% of what's going on in a person's behavior. So, one of the big criticisms of those traditional theories is, what good is the theory? Even if you're sure that what you're theorizing about is happening, if it's only happening in about 2% of the cases, or only explains about 2% of a person's behavior, we want more. We want to be able to explain much more of the variation in what people do with our theory.